Price discrimination. Now, even though this is a fairly small part of the spec, do not be deceived because it is actually assessed fairly regularly. Now, the whole of price discrimination can be summarized into this one definition. And this is 100% one of the definitions I would recommend that you should be able to recall. So, the way I would define price discrimination is when a firm charges different groups of consumers different prices but for the same good/service. Now, thinking about the incentives for firms to price discriminate. So why do firms want to price discriminate? Now think back to the classic economic assumption that time and time again I keep coming back to, is that firms are profit maximizers. Now, the reason why firms want to price discriminate is to just further that objective, is so they can make more supernormal profit. So firms price discriminate by splitting their consumer base into elastic versus inelastic demand consumers. They do this as inelastic demand consumers, for example, are less responsive to changes in prices. Therefore, firms can get away with charging them higher prices, and if they can get away with charging them higher prices because they're less responsive, that in turn means more supernormal profit. Now, thinking about the elastic demand consumers, as we know, they will be much more responsive to changes in price. Therefore, by a firm price discriminating by charging two separate prices, it can charge the inelastic demand consumers high prices and the elastic demand consumers low prices, allowing them to keep demand from both consumers, therefore allowing firms to achieve best of both worlds and maximizing their supernormal profit. As for example, if a firm charges one price, it's not going to be optimized to both groups of consumers. But if a firm charges two different prices, they can optimize it to both groups of consumers. And knowing a good example of price discrimination can really help add a bit of depth to your essays. And the classic example most students would give is just train tickets, the difference between under 16s and over 16s. But there are a few more great real world examples you can give as well. For example, very similar to train tickets, airlines. Airlines are massive in price discriminating, as if you think back to the definition, they're selling tickets for the same flight but charging different prices. And they base the prices of their flight on many factors such as booking in advance, first class versus economy. And what are these factors used to do? To split their consumer base, to split the elastic versus inelastic demand consumers, therefore to allow them to make the maximum supernormal profits. Now, so far we've only labelled the positives of price discrimination, but there are a few conditions a firm has to meet to be able to price discriminate successfully. First and foremost, market power. So to be able to exploit inelastic demand consumers with higher prices, firms must have enough market share to be able to increase prices without losing all demand. As for example, a new firm just joining the market would not be able to practice price discrimination as they would not have the market power required to do so. Secondly, and a massive one, is information. A firm must be able to split their consumer base, so they must know which consumers are elastic versus which consumers are inelastic. As if they cannot split their consumer base, it means they may charge an elastic demand consumer inelastic demand consumer prices, meaning that they will totally lose their demand because the elastic demand consumer won't be able to afford it, meaning that they will actually be worse off because they are price discriminating. And that is definitely one of the main limitations of price discrimination, as price discrimination won't be perfect. Therefore, in some situations, elastic demand consumers may be charged inelastic demand consumers' prices. Then lastly, to limit reselling. So they must stop elastic demand consumers selling to inelastic demand consumers. And a really topical one is discount codes or takeaways, clothes shopping. For example, lots of shops only allow them on new accounts or first-time buyers, and other things such as train tickets. You can't buy it under 16s tickets, so elastic demand consumers, and use it as an inelastic demand consumer, so someone over 16. So, price discrimination diagrams. Now, for this, you might have seen loads of different diagrams, heard of first degree, second degree, third degree price discrimination, but for AQA, all you need to do is keep it really simple, and what I would recommend, just learn these three diagrams. They all work hand in hand and you'll be set for your exam. You'll have all you need for your analysis, evaluation, and if you look in previous AQA mark schemes, this is a diagram they want to see. So, we mentioned in a previous video, price discrimination occurs when firms split their consumer base into elastic versus inelastic demand consumers, and this is exactly what the first two diagrams are going to be. So for our first two diagrams, we're going to label them elastic, inelastic, and then our last one is going to be named total. Now, these three diagrams represent the different prices firms charge consumers. Now, if a firm is price discriminating, like we learned previously, they're going to split their consumer base, therefore they're going to charge elastic and inelastic demand consumers different prices. But the total diagram, that shows what would happen if a firm is not price discriminating. So the total diagram is just when a firm is charging every consumer the same price. So basically we've got a comparison between price discrimination and non-price discrimination. Okay, so let's get started off with the diagrams. As you know, first thing always is axes. So on your y-axis is still cost / revenue, and on your x-axis still quantity. So let's start with adding the demand curves. So for the elastic diagram, as you can imagine, it's very simple. Just as you'll know from very early on in year 12, just drawing a normal elastic demand curve. Then same thing for inelastic, just a normal inelastic demand curve. Then you have your total diagram. Now this is a bit unique compared to the first two. So the way you need to imagine it is just merging the first two together. So this is the demand curve for total. As I was saying, it's almost merged together. So initially we are inelastic, but then we get to the point where now we reach the elastic stage, and now the diagram becomes elastic. So it was initially inelastic, then juts out and becomes elastic. Now that's probably the hardest bit there is to remember with this diagram, but now let's add the rest of the curves. So let's start with adding your MR curve. Now the rule is exactly the same, it's just twice as steep as your demand curve. So it would just look something like this. So for your elastic diagram, just twice as steep as I was saying, so somewhere about there. Then for inelastic, again twice as steep. Fairly simple stuff. So even though our total diagram looks slightly unique, it still follows the same rule. So just twice as steep, and then just something like this should be fine. So MR. So now lastly we have our cost curves to add. So our MC and our AC curve. Now I'll show you how we do this. So all it is a straight horizontal line looking something like this, and we would just label this MC equals AC. Now at A level you don't need to understand why MC and AC is constant and why it's horizontal. All you need to do is be able to recall this. Now that's your cost curves for your total diagram, and it's exactly the same for your inelastic and elastic, but I don't have a ruler here, so it's going to be slightly harder than you guys drawing it, so it might be slightly up or below, but yeah. So MC equals AC, then again, trying to make it as accurate as possible without a ruler. Then MC equals AC. So yeah, and now that's all your curves done. So we've got all four. We've got MC, AC, MR, and demand curve. Now, although these diagrams already look perfect, let's add the finishing touches to them. And what do I mean by finishing touches? The profit maximization points. So just like before, still the same routine where MC equals MR. So for example, on the total demand curve, MC equals MR here. You just go up till you hit your D equals AR curve, go left from there, and now this would be your box of supernormal profit, and this would be the price they charge. And just quickly for the inelastic, MC equals MR here, you go up until you hit your D equals AR curve, then this would be your P max price here, P max, and this would be your box of supernormal profit, and same thing for elastic. Now in purple are all the boxes of supernormal profit labeled up. But let's see what else the diagram shows. So if you look at the prices, so labeled PM on these diagrams, it shows that elastic demand consumers receive lower prices and inelastic demand consumers receive higher prices. And this is definitely one of the positives of price discrimination you could talk about. It reduces inequality, improves consumer welfare for the poorest in society, allows them to maybe afford goods they could not before without price discrimination. So there are lots of positives you can mention with price discrimination, and this is definitely one of them. Then relating it back to the main reason why firms price discriminate. What do we say? The main incentive for firms is that they will receive higher supernormal profits, and this is the main thing this diagram will show. So if you label up these boxes of supernormal profit, we can label this A, we can label this B, and we can label this C. And what this diagram should show is that A plus B, so when a firm is price discriminating, is greater than C. And that's almost the perfect way to show your examiners the reason why firms price discriminate. You know, you're getting loads of application, loads of analysis marks by showing and comparing, contrasting those boxes of supernormal profit and showing the real incentive why firms choose to price discriminate. And if you didn't understand that, all this means is if we combine both boxes of supernormal profit, both A and B, they will be greater than C. And C is if a firm did not price discriminate. So by a firm price discriminating, they can gain 2 boxes of supernormal profit, which in turn will be larger than 1 box of supernormal profit. Okay, so just to summarize price discrimination diagrams and give you a checklist. So of course, first thing is axes. So y-axis cost revenue, x-axis quantity, and then for price discrimination, we have 3 diagrams. We have our elastic, inelastic, and total. And just to remember, total is if a firm was not price discriminating. So then secondly, actually getting started with our curves, we first need to add our demand curve. And remember, for elastic and inelastic, it's just like what you learn in year 12, just your standard elastic, inelastic demand curves. But then for total, it's merging them both together. And remember, it just juts out slightly at the end, so it's straight down, then comes out a bit. Then thirdly, just your usual MR curve, and like we've already said, twice as steep as your demand curve. Then our other unique curves in this situation are our cost curves. So our marginal cost curve and our average cost curve, and just to re-jog your memory, just a horizontal line. Then of course, showing the box as supernormal profit, and then like I labelled on the diagram, you can always show A plus B is greater than C, thus showing the incentive for firms wanting to price discriminate. And then just a summary of some of the notes we took on the diagram.